The photograph came from a locked drawer in the basement of the Dakota Historical Society, a drawer that no one had cataloged in decades. It was discovered by accident when the curator, cleaning out boxes of damaged prints, found a small envelope marked simply Corridor in 1905. The paper was brittle, the handwriting cramped and fading, but the photograph inside had been preserved almost too well. It was small, barely larger than a postcard, mounted on dark cardboard. The image, when held to the light, revealed a narrow hallway, a single window at the far end, and 5 children standing in a line. They wore identical wool uniforms, the kind issued by boarding schools that promised to civilize native children through order and silence. Their shoes were polished, their hair cropped, their collars stiff. Behind them, the walls were plain, scrubbed clean, though faint chalk lines still lingered near the floorboards, as if someone had once marked their height there. The archivist studying the photograph couldn't say what drew her attention first, the children's stillness, or the whisper caught mid-breath. 5 children, 4 motionless, one leaning slightly toward the other, lips parted, as though he had spoken just as the shutter opened. She leaned closer, adjusting the magnifier. The detail was astonishing for its age, the grain fine, the light perfectly balanced, and yet there was something strange. The whispering boy's chest was bare of any identification tag. Each of the others bore a number, 47, 48, 49, 50, but his jacket showed only a torn thread where a tag had once been sewn. At first she assumed it was lost, a small tear, a forgotten detail, but the longer she looked, the more her unease grew. The boy's hand, small, clenched, held what appeared to be a folded cloth. It was impossible to tell if it was a handkerchief or something else, but the way he held it, it was as though it mattered to him more than the photograph itself. She turned the print slightly, letting the lamplight slide across it. That's when she saw the faintest outline at the edge of the image, a blur that might have been a shape, or perhaps a flaw in the emulsion. It stood near the shadowed door at the end of the corridor, tall and thin, like the suggestion of someone watching. She adjusted the light again. The shape vanished. Later that night, the archivist logged the photo into the database under its provisional title, Boarding School Corridor, Dakota Territory, 1905, Unidentified Children. But when she typed the accession number, her computer froze for a moment. The field labeled Subject filled itself automatically. Name, Joseph. She deleted it, frowning. The field filled again. Joseph. She sighed, saved the file manually, and shut the computer down. Before leaving, she looked once more at the photograph under the lamp. The whispering boy seemed almost alive in the dim light, his lips parted in mid-breath, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought she saw the faintest impression of movement in his eyes, like reflection, but from what? There was no light source that could explain it. She placed the photograph back into its envelope, locked the drawer, and turned out the light. The echo of her footsteps in the hallway sounded too loud. The photograph stayed in her mind that night. She dreamed of corridors, long, silent, endless, of footsteps that didn't echo back, of a faint voice whispering behind her, a boy's voice, soft and broken, "Say my name." When she woke, her throat was dry, her pulse heavy. She didn't remember falling asleep. She decided to visit the archives early. When she arrived, the drawer was already open. The photograph was gone. In its place lay a single folded slip of paper, yellowed and torn, like the edge of an old tag. One word written in pencil, uneven but deliberate, Joseph. She found the photograph hours later, not in the drawer, but lying face down on her desk. The back was blank, but when she lifted it, she noticed faint indentations, words pressed hard enough to leave marks through the backing. He whispered the name they took from him. The air in the room felt colder. She held the photograph up again, this time under sunlight. Something had changed. The boy's head was tilted slightly more than before, his mouth opened just a little wider. The light from the window behind him fell differently now, almost reaching his face. The archivist stared at it for a long time, until she noticed something else, a faint line along the photograph's bottom edge, like handwriting barely erased. She tilted it toward the light, squinting. Property of the St. Francis Indian Industrial School. She searched the archives database. The school no longer existed. It had been demolished in 1917 after a fire. Only fragments of its records survived. Among them, she found a ledger listing names and admissions. Children between the ages of 6 and 12 brought from reservations across the Dakota Territory. Most had English names assigned by the school, but one record stood out. 51, name withdrawn. Child unresponsive, reassigned to field labor 1905. There was no surname, no tribal affiliation, no note of where he went after that. She looked back at the photograph. There were only 5 children, tags numbered 47 to 50, no 51, That night she left the photograph in her office again, but before locking up she took one last look. The whispering boy was still there, his lips half open, as if caught forever between breath and speech. She turned off the light, but before the room went completely dark she thought she heard something faint, not quite sound, not quite memory, a soft, almost pleading voice. "Joseph isn't my real name." The corridor smelled of soap, chalk, and boiled starch. Every morning began with the same sound, a bell sharp and hollow, echoing through the dormitory like a command carved into the air. The children woke in rows, their beds perfectly aligned, each one made identical to the next. There were no names here, only numbers. Names, they were told, were like wild weeds, best uprooted before they spread. The boarding school stood on a flat stretch of land where nothing broke the horizon. Built from pale stone and imported timber, it was meant to look permanent, strong, like civilization itself planted in the middle of open prairie. But its walls heard everything: the whispers, the prayers, the quiet scraping of chalk as teachers replaced old words with new ones. They came from different tribes, different tongues. They arrived barefoot, some still clutching small bundles of home. Their hair was cut on the first day. Their old clothes were burned. Their language was forbidden. If they spoke in it, they scrubbed the floors. If they cried, they wrote the Lord's Prayer 100 times. If they refused, they were sent to the corridor. The corridor was long and narrow, lit only by the tall window at its end. That was where they stood, until they forgot why they had been sent there. Sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. The boy in the photograph had stood there longer than most. He was small, maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. No one knew exactly. His file was missing, or perhaps it had never existed. The teachers called him Joseph, though he never answered to it. When they asked his real name, he stared at the floor and said nothing. They punished silence as much as rebellion, but he did not break. He watched the others, the ones who whispered their real names into the cracks of the wall when they thought no one was listening. Some wrote them under their beds, others carved them into the underside of desks. Every week those names were found and erased. Every week someone forgot how to say their own. The girls braided their hair again in secret, even though it wasn't allowed. The boys hummed songs when the lights went out, soft as breathing. They were trying to remember. And still the corridor waited. When Joseph was sent there, he didn't cry like the others. He stood still, eyes fixed on the light spilling from the window. His shadow stretched long across the floorboards. The matron watched him from the far end of the hall, waiting for him to move, to shiver, to flinch. But he didn't. After an hour, she left him there. By evening, he was gone. They found him sitting in the classroom, his desk perfectly arranged, his slate wiped clean. He had written only one word on the edge of the board, a name no one could pronounce. The letters curved like branches. The teacher erased it before anyone else saw. The next morning, his uniform tag, number 51, was missing. Weeks passed. The boy continued his lessons, silent and watchful. He followed every order but never spoke unless forced. He seemed smaller each day, not thinner but quieter, like a shadow that had learned to hide. Sometimes, when the teachers lined them up in the corridor for inspection, another child would glance at him and whisper, "What's your name?" He would turn, lean slightly closer, and whisper something back. No one could ever repeat what he said. The teachers noticed that those who stood beside him began to forget things, small things at first. The word for bread, the way home smelled, the name of their mother. They called it the whisper sickness. They said it was nonsense. But one night, a matron found two children speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She beat them until they stopped, and when she asked who taught them the words, both said the same thing: the boy in the corridor. In the photograph, his lips are caught mid-whisper, but that day, the day the picture was taken, none of the children remembered hearing him speak. The photographer, a man sent from the city to document the progress of education, arrived just after morning prayers. He asked the teachers to line the children in front of the classroom, but the light was poor. "The corridor will do," he said. They obeyed. 5 children, straight lines, polished shoes, folded hands. He told them to stay still. The flash went off. The room filled with the smell of burning powder. Someone coughed, and then, in the second before silence returned, one child leaned forward and whispered something, soft, almost tender, toward the one beside him. The photographer lowered the camera. Who spoke? No one answered. He assumed it was the blur. Old film, he thought. Exposure error. But when he developed the plate that evening, he stared for a long time at the boy's face. The mouth was open, mid-word, the eyes fixed not on the camera but on him. He closed the darkroom door and developed the plate again, thinking he'd misprinted. The same image appeared, and beneath the faint grain of the photograph, along the lower border, a shape had appeared. Faint, like something scratched into the emulsion from the inside. 4 letters, not English. He tried to wipe them away. They didn't fade. He covered the photograph, wrote corridor in 1905 on the envelope, and left it in the school's office before dawn. He told no one what he'd seen. 2 weeks later, the school caught fire. They said it was an accident, but when the building was cleared, they found only 4 small bodies in the dormitory. 5 names were recorded in the register. Number 51 was still missing. Years later, long after the school had been erased from maps, workers clearing debris found a metal tag buried under the floorboards. The number was still legible. 51. They sent it to the archives. It was placed in storage, mislabeled, and forgotten, until the photograph surfaced again. And when the archivist logged it into the system, the database added the tag number automatically, though she never entered it. 51. Missing. Presumed erased. In the decades after the fire, the land where the school once stood returned to silence. The prairie reclaimed it inch by inch. Grass grew over the stones, wind swept through the foundations, and only the outline of the main hall remained visible when the sun was low. Crows nested in the chimney ruins. No one remembered the children's names. The government closed the case quietly. Unfortunate loss, the report said. Records destroyed, site decommissioned. The few survivors from nearby towns remembered only the smell, burning varnish and wool, and the sound of singing that carried through the night before the roof fell. They said it wasn't English. In the 1930s, a surveyor mapping the region found fragments of the old school walls and a few personal effects buried in the soil. Pieces of a rosary, a broken ruler, a child's shoe. Among them was a photograph, folded in half, the edges burned, but the center miraculously clear. He sold it to an antique dealer in Bismarck for $5. The dealer hung it behind the counter, calling it the Corridor Children. Customers rarely noticed it, just 5 children, their faces blank, their eyes tired. But once in a while, someone would pause, frown, and lean closer. Funny thing, one man said, it looks like that one's moving. He pointed to the boy on the far right. The dealer laughed. Optical illusion, but the man insisted. He's whispering something. The dealer looked again. For a moment he thought he saw it too. A faint shift in the boy's lips, the blur of motion captured mid-breath. He rubbed his eyes. Trick of the light. That night, when he closed the shop, the air felt unusually cold. He covered the photograph with a cloth before turning out the lights. The next morning, the cloth was folded neatly on the counter. The photograph hung uncovered again, and across the lower border of the image, faint as breath on glass, 4 letters had appeared. Not English. They curved upward, like branches reaching for wind. The dealer sold the photograph within a week. The buyer, a young woman named Clara, collected antique portraits. She said she loved the melancholy in old faces, the dignity of stillness. She framed the photo and placed it above her desk. It stayed there for years, unmoving, patient, until one evening in 1946, when she brought it closer to the lamplight to dust the glass. There was a word she had never seen before scratched faintly into the frame's bottom edge. It looked like it had always been there, though she was certain it hadn't. The word seemed to change when she tilted it, sometimes Joseph, sometimes something else, something older that her mouth couldn't pronounce. That night she dreamed of a corridor, narrow, endless, echoing with footsteps. She saw 5 children standing in a row. She tried to speak to them, but only one turned his head, the smallest one. His mouth moved. She woke before he finished. When she rose, the house was cold. On the desk where the photograph stood, a thin line of dust had formed across the frame, except for one small, perfect space, the width of a child's fingertip. Years passed. Clara's health failed. Her nephew inherited the house and its contents, including the photograph. He didn't think much of it until his daughter began asking about the boy with no name. He laughed it off. What boy? She pointed to the picture. Him, the one at the end. There are 5 children, he said, all with names probably. She shook her head. No, he told me he forgot his. That night, she woke crying. He says they took it, she whispered. He says they burned it in the fire. The next morning, the photograph had fallen from the wall. The glass was cracked clean through the middle, splitting the image into 2 halves. The boy's face was directly on the line of fracture. They tried to fix it, but when the frame was replaced, something had changed again. The boy's mouth was closed now, and where his tag should have been, the torn thread on his jacket, a faint mark appeared, a shape like a handprint, small, smudged. In 1962, a group of anthropologists visited the Dakota Territory to collect oral histories. One elder, when shown a copy of the photograph, refused to touch it. He turned his head and muttered something under his breath. The translator asked what he'd said. He says it's not a photograph, the assistant replied. He says it's a door. When asked what that meant, the elder stood slowly, his voice trembling. He says the boy is still waiting for someone to say his name. The copy was archived in a university collection. Over time, the edges yellowed, the frame tarnished. Generations of students studied it without knowing its story, only that it carried an unease no one could quite explain. Some said if you stared long enough you could hear faint sounds, the scratch of chalk, the bell at dawn, footsteps in dust. Others claimed that if you whispered a name aloud while looking at the photograph, the light shifted. One student tried it as a dare. He whispered, "Joseph." Nothing happened. He laughed, turned to his friends. "See?" But when they looked back at the photograph, the boy's head was tilted differently. His lips parted again, and the word Joseph had been written across the bottom of the glass, backward from the inside. The photograph changed hands many more times after that. It survived moves, fires, floods, but each time it reappeared, the name had changed slightly, as if it were being translated again and again through forgotten languages. Yosef, Yosef, Cho-Sef, Yossi, until the name itself no longer sounded like anything human. And then, one day, it vanished entirely. No archives held it, no collections listed it. The record trail ended in 1989. But that same year, a curator in Fargo received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph, its corners frayed, its surface faded almost to nothing. 5 children stood in a corridor. On the back, written in faint pencil, were 6 words. He whispers still. Remember what was lost. In the present day, the archivist who found it, the same one who had discovered the earlier image marked Corridor, 1905, compared the 2 prints side by side. They were identical in every way, except one. In the newer image, there were 6 children. The last one stood partly in shadow, barely visible, his outline merging with the wall. His face was turned away, but his mouth, open mid-whisper, was the only part perfectly clear. When she adjusted the brightness on her monitor, something appeared along the bottom edge of the photograph. Name restored. She leaned closer, heart pounding. The name was there, faint but legible. Not Joseph. Something older, something she could not pronounce, but somehow recognized. The whisper that had traveled through a century had finally spoken. The archivist stopped sleeping. For days, she avoided looking directly at the photograph. She told herself she was being foolish. It was only an image, a chemical reaction on paper, nothing more. But even when she turned it face down, she could feel it there on her desk, like it was still watching through the back of the paper, through the wood, through everything. The building was silent after hours. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly. Dust drifted like snow through air that never moved. She'd grown used to that kind of silence, but now it sounded wrong, too full, like something breathing just beyond the range of hearing. One evening, she found herself alone in the records room, reading through the old admission logs from the destroyed boarding school. Most of the names were crossed out. Some were replaced with English ones, others marked only by numbers. But one entry was different. 51, transferred, destination unknown. Next to it, someone had written in pencil, "He remembered too much." She sat back slowly, heart tightening. The photograph was still on her desk upstairs. She hadn't moved it since the day she'd scanned it, but she remembered something strange about the scan. The software had flagged it as containing unrecognized facial data. There were 5 children in the photo. The system had detected 6. That night, she reopened the image on her computer. The file loaded slowly, too slowly for its size. When it finally appeared, she felt her stomach tighten. There were 6 children now. The new figure stood at the far left, half in shadow. His uniform matched the others, but the edges of his body seemed blurred, unfinished. His face was turned slightly toward the camera, but not enough to show his features. The line of his jaw was too sharp, like something sketched rather than photographed. She zoomed in until the pixels broke apart. The grain of the image was smooth everywhere except where he stood. There, the film texture shifted, not random, but patterned, as if letters were hidden in the darkness. She increased the contrast. The shadows spelled something. "Remember me." She leaned back, trembling. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the screen, and for a moment, she thought she saw another reflection behind her, a smaller one. She turned. Nothing. The lights buzzed. The air vent clicked softly. When she turned back, the photograph was different again. The boy at the far right, the one who had always been whispering, now had his eyes open. They were looking directly at her. The next morning, she printed the photograph, thinking maybe the screen was playing tricks. The print emerged from the machine warm and faintly curled. She held it up to the light. 6 children, all in uniform. The boy at the end with open eyes, the one in shadow half-formed. She turned the paper over. A single word had appeared on the back in soft graphite, like someone had written it from the inside of the photograph. Home. The archivist began researching again. deeper this time. She learned that the St. Francis Industrial School had not been the only one. Across the Dakota Territory, dozens of institutions just like it had erased thousands of children in the same way. Their names changed, their languages forbidden, their histories scattered in dust. The whispering boy was no ghost, she realized. He was what happened when a name was taken but refused to die. He was memory itself, caught mid-breath. That night, the lights in the archive flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The emergency bulbs glowed faint red. She sat in the faint halo of her desk lamp, the photograph beside her. The air was colder now. She heard footsteps, not the echo of her own. These were softer, like bare feet on wood. They came from the far end of the hall, slow, careful. She stood, flashlight trembling in her hand. Hello? No answer. The sound grew closer. When she aimed the light down the corridor, it hit the glass display case where old photographs were kept, and inside the case, she froze. Her reflection was not alone. 6 small silhouettes stood behind her. For a moment she couldn't move. Then the light flickered again, and the case went empty. Only her reflection stared back, pale, wide-eyed, and trembling. When she returned to her desk, the photograph was gone. In its place lay 6 numbered tags, small rectangles of stiff cloth, each with a number written in faded ink, and one blank. She touched the blank one gently. It was cold, almost damp. Underneath it, a small scrap of paper had been left, torn from the corner of something older. It read, "The name is waiting for you." In the days that followed, she began hearing whispers. Not words exactly, but fragments of sound that seemed to come from the photograph's drawer, even when it was closed. Some nights, when she stayed late, she heard the faint scrape of chairs moving in empty rooms. And then one night she found the photograph again. It was lying on the floor by the window, the glass cracked, the frame half splintered. There were now 7 children. The 7th stood near the window, taller than the others, dressed in modern clothes. Her clothes. She dropped the photograph instantly. It landed face up. The boy who had been whispering was still in his place, eyes open, mouth forming a word she could almost read. Say it. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she packed the photograph, sealed it in an envelope, and drove out to the ruins of the old school. The foundation stone still stood, the ground uneven, the air thick with the smell of wet grass and something older, like the memory of smoke. She laid the photograph on the ground and whispered, "I don't know your real name." The wind answered first, rustling through the tall grass. Then, faint, so faint she thought she imagined it, a voice. It was not angry, it was tired. It said something she didn't understand, soft syllables carried like breath. And for the first time she understood that the boy had never wanted revenge. He only wanted to be remembered the way he was before he was renamed. The earth beneath the photograph trembled slightly. The paper shifted. The ink on the back began to blur, not vanishing but changing. When she picked it up again, the word home was gone. In its place was a new one, free. She left the photograph there that night, but in the morning when she returned to the archives, the envelope she had used was lying on her desk, empty. The tags were gone too. She sat down slowly, staring at the space where the photograph had always been, and for a moment, she thought she heard a sound, soft and close like breath beside her ear, a whisper, calm and clear, "Thank you." She turned. The corridor behind her was empty, but the air felt lighter, and somewhere, in the ruins of a school that had tried to erase him, a boy finally slept without silence. The photograph no longer exists, or perhaps it never did. Perhaps it was only a fragment of memory caught between exposure and erasure, a single moment that refused to dissolve even when everything else did. The archivist never spoke publicly about what happened. She left the Historical Society quietly, moving west, leaving no forwarding address. Her office was cleared a month later. The drawers were empty, the desk clean, except for a single envelope sealed in wax. It was addressed to whoever would open it next. Inside, there was no letter, only a small piece of faded photographic paper. The surface was blank, at first, but when held under light, 5 faint figures appeared, their outlines fading and reappearing like breath on glass. 5, then 6, then 5 again, and beneath them, scrawled in uneven ink, "The name is safe." The archivist's replacement was a young man named Ethan. He found the envelope on his first day and assumed it was part of an unfinished exhibit. He placed it with other items scheduled for restoration, unaware that its contents had already been scanned dozens of times before. He ran the same process: catalog, scan, digitize, archive. But this time, the scanner did something new. It froze midway through, emitting a faint sound, like static between radio frequencies. The light flickered once, then again. When the image appeared on his monitor, he frowned. The preview was empty, just a dim corridor and a window at the end. But then slowly, 5 shapes emerged. The program labeled the file automatically. Boarding school corridor, Dakota Territory, 1905, restoration scan. Ethan clicked to zoom in. The file name changed on its own. Whisper.wav. He blinked. That wasn't even an image format. He opened it anyway. Instead of a photograph, the speakers filled with faint noise. Soft, rhythmic, like someone breathing close to the microphone. Then came the whisper, distant but clear, layered like wind moving through leaves. It said only one thing: do not forget us. The sound ended. The file closed itself. When Ethan checked the system log, the entry for the photograph was gone. No trace. Only one note appeared in the cache metadata: accessed once, stored nowhere. A few weeks later, the Historical Society held a small exhibit called Voices from the Plains. It displayed letters, maps, and reconstructed records from the boarding schools that had once spread across the Dakotas. The photograph wasn't part of the collection, but one visitor, an elderly woman with a weathered face and steady hands, stopped in front of an empty frame near the end of the gallery. There was nothing inside it, just a title card that read, Boarding School Corridor, Dakota Territory, Unknown. The woman tilted her head. Her eyes softened. "I know this place," she whispered. Her granddaughter tugged her sleeve. "Grandma, there's nothing there." The old woman smiled faintly. "You just have to look long enough." That night, when the gallery closed, a security guard making rounds walked past the same empty frame. He paused, frowning. The glass was fogged from the inside. He wiped it clean with his sleeve. For a second, just long enough for him to doubt himself, he saw them. 5 children in uniform, standing in a narrow hallway of light. The one at the end, the smallest, was whispering something. The guard leaned closer, trying to hear. Then the condensation vanished. The glass cleared. Only his reflection remained. He exhaled, shook his head, and moved on. But as he turned away, the faint outline of a 6th figure appeared behind him in the reflection, smaller than the rest, face half hidden, mouth open mid-breath. And on the frame's title card, a single new word had appeared beneath "Unknown," written in pale gray pencil, "Remembered." The next morning, the staff found the card unchanged. No handwriting, no trace of fog. But in the security footage from that night, the camera facing the corridor glitched for exactly 7 seconds. During those 7 seconds, faint shapes flickered across the wall, 5 shadows moving in perfect silence, one whispering to another. When the recording stabilized, the corridor was empty, but faint audio distortion captured something else. A voice, quiet as breath, layered beneath the static. A child's voice. He said it for us. Years later, when the museum closed for renovations, that empty frame was packed into storage with other unused mounts. Workers later claimed they heard sounds from the crate, soft tapping like fingernails on glass. No one opened it. When the exhibit reopened under a new curator, the frame was missing. The new director didn't notice until weeks later, when a local reporter visited to write about the museum's relaunch. The article included several photographs of the new displays. In one of them, unremarkable at first, a reflection could be seen in the glass of a different exhibit, a narrow corridor, 5 children, and one, at the end, whispering toward the camera. No one knows where the photograph truly is. Some say it was never just one, that every time the story is told, another copy forms, not on paper, but somewhere quieter, somewhere between memory and air. And in each version, the whisper changes. Sometimes it says remember, sometimes thank you, sometimes nothing at all. But always, there is the faint sound of breath between words, proof that something once living still lingers, still waits to be named. If you've seen the photograph, even just once, online, in a dream, in passing, you are now part of it. Because memory isn't bound to film or glass, it's carried in those who look and listen and choose not to forget. So if one night you wake and hear a voice, soft as dust, whispering your name, don't be afraid. He's only making sure you still remember his. Subscribe to Veilside Stories for more forgotten moments like this, echoes of lives that history tried to silence, and the quiet proof that they never really vanished. The next story is already waiting. Look closely. You might hear it breathe.